Oh, her warning.
Yeah, this is a girl who says that man
well,
has trouble.
This did happen to me, and it was a he. And I went right ahead and married the guy, and it was Gary.
Is that right? Now, there you are. You've been married 13 years.
Right.
So, you see that?
At 77, Lucille Ball was done playing the part. The red hair was still there, but the slapstick was gone, replaced by the quiet gravity of a woman who had seen it all. For decades, she kept the real story of Lucy and Desi locked away. A messy, beautiful, and sometimes brutal truth that the cameras never caught. It wasn't just a sitcom romance, it was a high-stakes addiction. And before she left, Lucille finally let the world in. The burden behind fame. To understand the truth Lucille Ball finally shared at the end of her life, you have to understand the massive, glittering wall she had to tear down. In the 50s, the Ricardos weren't just characters on a screen. They were the gold standard for the American dream. Every Monday night, 40 million people tuned in to see a husband and wife who navigated life's messes with a wink and a smile. No matter how big the disaster, they always made up by the time the credits rolled. But by age 77, Lucille was ready to admit that the happy ending was the hardest acting job she ever had. It was a performance that required every ounce of her strength. The reality was that the show wasn't a reflection of her marriage. It was a desperate, calculated attempt to save it. Lucille famously fought the network executives to get Desi cast as her on-screen husband. The suits didn't think a Cuban man with a thick accent would fly in Middle America, but Lucy wouldn't budge. Her motivation wasn't just about chemistry or artistic vision. She knew that if Desi stayed on the road with his orchestra, surrounded by the temptations of the nightlife, their marriage would be over. She believed that if they worked together, shared a dressing room, and looked into each other's eyes under the studio lights, she could keep him close. She traded her private life for a television set, hoping a fictional world would fix a real one. At 77, she looked back on those years with a sharp, clear-eyed realization. They had built a global empire on a foundation that was already cracking. The truth, she eventually revealed, wasn't that they didn't love each other. It was that they loved each other with a frantic, destructive intensity. It was a cycle of passion and pain that started long before the first pilot was ever filmed. While the world saw Lucy Ricardo's hilarious schemes to get into show business, the real Lucille Ball was scheming just to keep her husband home for dinner. The weight of maintaining that public image was a heavy burden. They were the most powerful couple in Hollywood, the heads of Desi Studios, and the pioneers of the three-camera sitcom. Yet, behind the scenes, the laughter often stopped the moment the applause sign went dark. Lucille's late-life reflections painted a picture of a woman who was tired of the masquerade. She acknowledged that the fame they chased together became the very thing that drove them apart. By the time the world realized they weren't the Ricardos, the damage was done. The house that Magic built was beautiful to look at from the outside, but inside, the walls were beginning to close in on the two people who called it home. The cameras caught the comedy, but the real drama started long before the lights went up. Two drifters in the dark. To understand how Lucille and Desi became the most powerful couple in television, you have to look at the two broken roads that led them to the same Hollywood soundstage. They weren't born into royalty. They were survivors who found in each other a shared language of ambition and loneliness. Lucille was a girl from Jamestown, New York, who had learned early on that the world didn't owe her any favors. Her childhood was marked by the sudden death of her father and a freak shooting accident that left her family in financial ruin. She was a B-movie actress who had spent years being told she was too old, too tall, or too tough to be a leading lady. She was a workhorse in a town that preferred show ponies. Then there was Desi. To the American public, he was the charming guy with the conga drum. But his past was colored by the smoke of a revolution. He was a son of Cuban aristocracy whose family had lost everything: their mansions, their horses, their dignity, when the government was overthrown. He fled to Miami with nothing, cleaning bird cages and sleeping in a garage while he learned how to turn his Cuban heritage into a brand. When he met Lucille on the set of Too Many Girls in 1940, it wasn't a gentle spark, It was a head-on collision. Lucille later recalled that she looked like a mess the day they met, sporting a fake black eye and tangled hair from a previous scene. But Desi didn't see a B-list actress. He saw a powerhouse. And she didn't see just a bandleader. She saw a man who could command a room with a single smile. They were married within 6 months, a decision that shocked their friends and worried their families. On paper, it made no sense. He was younger, he was a night owl, and he was a Latin heartthrob in a town that was deeply segregated. She was a disciplined, no-nonsense professional who craved the security of a steady paycheck and a quiet home. In those early years, the hidden truth was that they were constantly trying to bridge the gap between their two worlds. Lucille spent her days at the studio, while Desi spent his nights in smoky clubs. They were two drifters passing in the dark, communicating through notes left on the kitchen table. The distance created a vacuum of jealousy and suspicion. Lucille would admit decades later that her obsession with his whereabouts started almost immediately. She knew the way women looked at him, and she knew that his Cuban macho culture didn't necessarily value monogamy the way her small-town New York upbringing did. They were two people who had been uprooted by life and were desperate to plant seeds together. But they didn't know how to handle the weather. Every time they tried to settle into a normal rhythm, the pressure of Hollywood or the temptation of the road would pull them apart. They were addicted to the heat of their romance, but they were shivering in the cold reality of their differences. By the time 1950 rolled around, they weren't just a couple. They were a powder keg. They needed a miracle to stay together. And that miracle came in the form of a black-and-white television script that would change everything. They decided to stop fighting each other and start fighting the world. Inventing the future. By 1950, the hidden truth was that the marriage was functionally over. Desi was always on the road, and Lucy was tired of being a studio widow. When CBS approached her about bringing her popular radio show, My Favorite Husband, to the small screen, she saw more than a career opportunity. She saw a leash. She told the executives she wouldn't do it unless her real-life husband played her on-screen husband. The network was horrified. They told her nobody would believe a red-headed American girl was married to a man with a conga drum and a heavy accent. Lucy's response was simple. "What do you mean they won't believe it? We are married." To prove the doubters wrong, they put their own money on the line. They formed Desilu Productions, a move that would eventually make them the most powerful moguls in the industry. But at the time, it was just a gamble to keep their house together. They went on the road with a vaudeville act to show the world that their chemistry was undeniable. The audiences roared, the networks folded, and I Love Lucy was born. But as Lucille would reflect at 77, the moment they won that battle, they signed away their peace of mind. The innovation they brought to the screen was staggering. Desi wasn't just a musician, he was a logistical genius. He pioneered the 3-camera system and the use of high-quality film stock so the show could be rebroadcast, essentially inventing the rerun and creating a fortune in syndication. While Lucy was the perfectionist on the floor, obsessing over the timing of a gag or the exact placement of a prop, Desi was in the back room building an empire. For a few years, the plan actually worked. They were together every day. They had 2 children, little Lucy and Desi Jr., whose births were national events. But the truth, Lucille later confessed, was that the pressure of the empire became a third party in their marriage. Desilu grew into a monster that required constant feeding. They bought the RKO lot, the very studio where they had first met as struggling actors, and suddenly they were responsible for thousands of employees and dozens of other shows. The business replaced the marriage. Desi, burdened by the stress of being a minority executive in a cutthroat industry, began to lean harder on the bottle. Lucy, meanwhile, became increasingly difficult on set, her anxiety manifesting as a rigid need for control. At 77, she looked back on the mid-50s as a period of beautiful exhaustion. She recalled how they would film a show in front of a live audience, basking in the genuine laughter of the crowd, only to go home and sit in separate rooms. The show was a masterpiece of joy, but the production of it was a military operation. She was the general, and Desi was the architect, but neither of them was the spouse anymore. They had successfully invented the future of television, but they had forgotten to invent a way to be happy in the present. The most painful part of the truth was the realization that the more successful they became, the more Desi felt the need to escape. He was the king of Hollywood, but he felt like he was living in Lucy's shadow, despite being the one who ran the company. To the world, he was Ricky, the husband who was constantly exasperated by his wife's antics. In reality, he was a man drowning in responsibilities he never really wanted, while his wife watched him slip away from behind the safety of a clown mask. They were trapped in a loop. The show required them to be in love. The business required them to be partners. And the truth required them to be honest. But honesty was the one thing they couldn't afford. The empire was standing tall, but the king and queen were living in different castles. The shadows in the studio. By the mid-50s, the set of I Love Lucy was the most famous address in the world. But for Lucille, it had become a gilded cage. At 77, she finally admitted that the hidden truth of their golden era was a grueling exercise in emotional suppression. Every morning, she would transform into the bubbly, chaotic Lucy Ricardo, while her heart was heavy with the knowledge of where Desi had been the night before. The studio was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage where they performed a version of a marriage that was rapidly dissolving in real time. The contrast between the bright lights of the soundstage and the dark reality of their private lives was becoming unbearable. Desi's descent into alcoholism and compulsive infidelity wasn't just a private failing. It was a byproduct of the immense pressure he felt as the man behind the woman. While Lucy was the face of the brand, Desi was the brains of the business, yet the public rarely gave him the credit he deserved. He was often dismissed as the seed kick with the accent, a slight that bruised his ego and pushed him toward the comfort of the bottle and the company of other women. Lucille would later recall the agonizing nights spent waiting for the sound of his car in the driveway, knowing that even when he arrived, he wouldn't truly be there. The truth at 77 was that she spent years playing detective, chasing shadows that she could never quite catch. The atmosphere on set shifted from collaborative to clinical. Lucy's perfectionism, once a tool for comedic brilliance, became a shield against her domestic pain. She demanded total control because her home life was completely out of control. She would drill the cast for hours on a single bit, her sharp tongue leaving little room for error. To the crew, she was the queen of comedy, but to those who knew her best, she was a woman trying to micromanage her way out of a heartbreak. She admitted in her later years that she was often no fun to be around during that time, an admission that carried the weight of decades of self-reflection and hard-earned honesty. Even as the shadows lengthened, the couple continued to break ground. They were the first to show a pregnant woman on television, a move that was revolutionary at the time. Yet, even that milestone was tainted by the reality of their situation. Lucille recalled the irony of the nation celebrating her TV baby while she was terrified that her real marriage wouldn't last long enough to see the child grow up. The public's obsession with their lives meant they couldn't even argue in peace. Every disagreement was potential tabloid fodder. They were the pioneers of the celebrity fishbowl, living out their most painful moments under the magnifying glass of a global audience that refused to let them be anything less than perfect. The hidden truth was also found in the ledger books of Desilu. The studio was producing hits like The Untouchables and later Star Trek, making them incredibly wealthy. But the money couldn't buy the one thing Lucille wanted, Desi's sobriety and presence. She watched the man she loved disappear into a fog of scotch and resentment, and there was nothing she could do to pull him back. She realized that the very thing she had created to save them, the show, the studio, the fame, had become the very thing that was tearing them apart. The business was a runaway train, and they were both strapped to the tracks, unable to jump off without destroying everything they had built for their children. At 77, Lucille spoke of these years with a sense of weary grace. She didn't blame Desi entirely, nor did she play the victim. She saw it for what it was, a perfect storm of ambition, addiction, and the impossible expectations of a public that loved Lucy and Ricky more than they loved Lucille and Desi. The shadows in the studio were long, and they were cold, and they eventually covered every corner of their lives. By the time the final episode of the original series aired, the laughter in the background was a recording, but the tears behind the scenes were entirely real. The curtain was finally coming down, but the end of the show was only the beginning of the goodbye. The breaking point and the 1960 divorce. By 1960, the masquerade had reached its limit. The world still wanted the Ricardos, but Lucille and Desi were barely functioning as a couple. At 77, Lucy would look back on this specific year as the moment the glass finally shattered beyond repair. They were filming the Lucy-Desi Comedy Hour specials, which were longer and more stressful than the original half-hour format. On camera, they were still the masters of timing. Off camera, the air was thick with a silence that was louder than any laugh track. The hidden truth was that they had stopped being a family and had become a corporate entity that happened to share a bedroom. The breaking point didn't come with a dramatic scream or a single act of betrayal. It was the slow, agonizing realization that they were killing each other by staying together. Desi's health was failing. The stress of running the studio while battling his demons had turned the once vibrant conga king into a ghost of himself. Lucille later admitted that she reached a point where she couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore. She realized that by protecting him, she was enabling the very behavior that was tearing their children's lives apart. The decision to file for divorce was the hardest thing she ever did, not because she didn't love him, but because she loved him enough to know they had to stop. The day they filmed their final scene together is etched in Hollywood history, but at 77, Lucille shared the visceral pain of that morning. They had to film a scene where they kissed, a moment of scripted affection for the fans. When the director yelled, "Cut!" the entire crew stood in a silence that felt like a funeral. They all knew. The divorce papers were already drafted. The empire was being split down the middle. As they walked off the set for the last time as husband and wife, Desi leaned in and whispered, "Adios, Chiquita." It wasn't just a line from a script. It was the final exhale of a 20-year war. The public reaction was one of genuine mourning. People felt as though their own parents were splitting up. But the truth Lucille carried for decades was the sheer logistical nightmare of the aftermath. She bought Desi out of Desilu, becoming the first woman to head a major studio. She was a woman in a man's world, carrying the weight of his legacy and her own future. She had to prove she could be Lucy without Ricky, a task that felt impossible when her heart was still at the house they no longer shared. She threw herself into work, but the work felt hollow without the partner who had built the cameras that filmed her. In her later reflections, she admitted that the divorce was a survival tactic. If she hadn't walked away, she feared they both would have gone under. She spent the next few years trying to reinvent herself, but the ghost of Desi Arnaz was in every corner of the studio. He was in the rafters, in the scripts, and in the eyes of their children. The hidden truth was that the divorce didn't end the relationship. It just changed the location. They were still the center of each other's gravity, even as they began to drift into different orbits. The 1960 divorce was a legal ending, but for Lucille, it was the start of a lifelong haunting. The legal papers said they were over, but their hearts hadn't read the fine print. Life apart, hearts entwined. After the split, the world expected Lucille Ball to move on and leave the Cuban firebrand in her rearview mirror. She did what was expected. She married Gary Morton, a stand-up comedian who provided the stability and peace that Desi never could. Gary was a safe harbor, a man who didn't drink, didn't gamble, and was content to live in the orbit of a superstar. At 77, Lucille was honest about the fact that her second marriage was a practical choice. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and quiet nights. But the hidden truth she carried through those decades was that while Gary had her hand, Desi still had her soul. Desi also remarried, finding a woman named Edith who looked remarkably like a brunette version of Lucille. It was a strange, parallel existence where both were trying to replace something that was, by definition, irreplaceable. Despite the new spouses and the separate lives, the tether between Lucy and Desi never actually snapped. They spoke on the phone constantly. When Lucille was stressed about the studio or a new show, it wasn't Gary she called for professional advice. It was Desi. He was the only person who understood the magnitude of the pressure she was under because he was the one who had built the pedestal she was standing on. At 77, she looked back on this period as a long, complicated dance of what-ifs. She admitted that she remained fiercely protective of Desi, even when he was at his lowest. When the tabloids went after him, she was his first line of defense. When he struggled with his health, she was the one checking in with his doctors. The truth was that their divorce had stripped away the toxic friction of living together, leaving behind a raw, undeniable friendship that was almost more intimate than their marriage had been. They were no longer fighting about late nights or other women. They were two old soldiers reminiscing about the war they had won together. The complexity of this entwined life was often hard for the people around them to navigate. Lucille's children later spoke of the palpable tension whenever the two were in the same room. Not a tension of anger, but of a magnetic pull that hadn't lost its strength. Lucy would admit late in life that she never stopped loving him for a single second. A confession that wasn't meant to disrespect Gary, but rather to acknowledge a biological fact of her existence. Desi was the father of her children and the architect of her greatest triumphs. You don't just get over a man like that. You just learn to live around the hole he left behind. As the years rolled on, the public started to see glimpses of this truth. They saw the way her face lit up when his name was mentioned in interviews. They saw the way she visited him in his final years at his home in Del Mar. The hidden truth was that their separation was a physical necessity, but an emotional impossibility. They had created a universe together in the 50s, and even though the stars had burned out, the gravity remained. Lucille spent 30 years living apart from Desi Arnaz, but at 77, she finally told the truth. She had never really left him at all. The phone would ring in the middle of the night, and without looking, she always knew who was on the other end. The 4 a.m. phone calls. As Lucille entered her 70s, the world saw a dignified legend, but her private life was soundtracked by the low, gravelly vibrato of a voice from her past. The hidden truth that finally emerged was the existence of the 4 a.m. phone calls. For years, long after the divorce and well into their respective second marriages, Lucille and Desi maintained a secret nocturnal lifeline. When the rest of the world was asleep and the masks of Hollywood royalty could finally be dropped, they would talk for hours. These weren't the conversations of business partners or bitter exes. They were the whispers of two people who were the only witnesses to each other's true lives. Desi would call from his home in Del Mar, often after a few drinks, his voice thick with nostalgia and the Spanish endearments he only used for her. At 77, Lucille admitted that these calls were her greatest comfort and her most profound secret. They would talk about the old days on the RKO lot, the way the light hit the set of the apartment on stage 6, and the children. But mostly, they talked about the what-ifs. Desi would often apologize for the chaos of the 50s, and Lucy, in the quiet of her bedroom, would forgive him over and over again. The truth was that they were still trying to solve the puzzle of their relationship, decades after the pieces had been scattered. These calls became even more frequent as Desi's health began to fail in the mid-80s. When he was diagnosed with lung cancer, the calls turned from nostalgic to urgent. Lucille became his emotional anchor. She wasn't just a former wife, she was the keeper of his history. She would remind him of his brilliance when he felt forgotten, and he would remind her of her beauty when she felt the sting of aging in a town that worships youth. She later confessed that during those late-night sessions, the years would melt away. She wasn't a 70-year-old icon, She was the young girl with the fake black eye, and he was the prince of the Tropicana. The final call came on November 30th, 1986, just 2 days before Desi passed away. It was their wedding anniversary. Lucille sat by the phone, and when it rang, she knew it was the end. They said, "I love you," one last time. It was a simple, devastating exchange that summarized 46 years of passion, production, and pain. When she hung up, she knew the most significant chapter of her life had closed. The hidden truth she finally shared at 77 was that the world's most famous divorce was actually the world's longest, most complicated love story. Even after he was gone, Lucille would sometimes catch herself reaching for the phone in the middle of the night. The silence that followed was a reminder of the price of a love that big. She realized that the calls hadn't just been about Desi. They had been about holding on to the only person who truly knew Lucille Ball, the woman, rather than Lucy, the character. At 77, she was finally ready to admit that the most important things they ever said to each other were never written in a script and were never heard by an audience. They were spoken in the dark, between two heartbeats, across a telephone line that bridged the gap between what was and what could have been. The legend was etched in stone, but the woman was finally ready to rest. The Redhead and the Conga King. By the time Lucille Ball reached 77, the hidden truth was no longer a burden to carry. It was her testament. She had spent a lifetime making the world laugh to keep herself from crying. But in those final years, she found a quiet peace in the wreckage. She realized that her story with Desi wasn't a tragedy because it ended. It was a triumph because it happened. They had revolutionized an industry, broken racial barriers, and created a blueprint for every sitcom that followed. But more importantly, they had loved each other with a raw honesty that survived even the divorce court. The story of Lucy and Desi isn't found in the reruns or the studio lot, but in the truth that even the most broken things can be beautiful. Lucille finally understood that you don't have to stay married to stay together. As she sat in her garden, reflecting on the man with the drum and the life they built, she knew the world would always love Lucy. But she was the only one who truly loved Desi. The mask was off, the lights were down, and for the first time in 77 years, Lucille Ball was simply herself. If you like this kind of deep dives, subscribe to the channel for more. Thanks for watching.